Whether we are talking about homemaking, work, or anything in between, perfection often is the enemy of good. And though I hope you are in a blissful state of thriving, the reality is sometimes we find ourselves in a season of surviving, just doing the bare minimum to get by. That's where I've been for the last few weeks, and it's not my first time at this rodeo. So today I want to share what to do when homemaking is hard. I have a different perspective about self-care than maybe what others have. I'll get into that in just a moment, but when I discover myself in a homemaking rut, the first thing I do is establish a self-care routine that gets me back on track. In my mind, self-care is not luxurious bubble baths and chocolates. I mean, that stuff is nice, don't get me wrong, who doesn't want that? But for me, true self-care is doing the things that need to be done that make my life easier later. Here I am making a flower arrangement for my cut flower garden. Most of these flowers are seeds I started from Floret. This doesn't necessarily make my life easier later, but it does bring a little life and vibrancy back into my home and into this space where I'm struggling to keep up. But more importantly, what I need to do is to get back in a routine, and I need to do that by cleaning. I am not here to tell you that to solve the problems of your life, you need to clean more, but I am here to tell you my house is a mess. So going back to this idea of self-care and what to do when homemaking is hard, sometimes the answer is to clean up. It is hard to get back in a routine and a groove if there is a lot of chaos surrounding you. Our internal environments inside of our minds and our external environments in our homes are intrinsically intertwined. I have been sick for about 2 weeks, and my child's been out of preschool for the entire time. So it's been a challenge around here. And almost every night for years, I completely cleaned the kitchen so that way in the morning, everything was tidy and ready to go. But I have not been doing that at all the last 2 weeks. And then every morning I come downstairs and there's a mess. And then that mess is hard to keep up with because as soon as the day starts, more mess begins to accumulate. So in order to get back into some place of stasis, the first thing that I recommend doing for my life, and that might work for yours too, is to get your stuff cleaned up and get yourself as organized as best as you can. Now remember, perfection, it is the enemy of good, so it doesn't have to be perfect. But when homemaking is hard, where can you tidy up the areas of your life that are making your days even harder? But when homemaking is hard, I think there needs to be a pretty delicate balance between what needs to be done and what can you let go. Because homemaking is mostly, in my experience, hard when I feel like I have to do everything, but I can't get anything done. My homemaking rut happened to fall right into the throes of food preservation season. So just a few days ago, I posted a video where I am preserving a year's worth of tomatoes, and that's just the beginning of what I'm hoping to preserve this year. So in the process of that, I'm also having to pick and choose what is the most important thing to do. I can only have access to the foods I'm trying to preserve for so long. I'm really deciding what needs to be done, what is the most important, and then the rest of it, I'm just letting go. And where I think routine and self-care begin to intertwine is when we understand what routines make us feel better, what routines get us out of the rut, make things easier. So the other thing that I am trying to build back into my routine is making food. I have not been feeling well. We have had more takeout and like pre-made meals than we've had in a really long time. So I am trying to get back into the groove of making food. So anytime I have leftover sourdough bread, I like to put it in the freezer and then use it up, usually for breadcrumbs or croutons. In this case, I'm making something similar to a panzanella salad, but it is warm. So I cubed up the leftover bread, toasted it in some butter, and now I'm topping it with sweet and sour tomatoes that I made in my Instant Pot. So this is a combination of some tomato, onion, green peppers that are cooked down in brown sugar and red wine vinegar into a really delicious stewed tomato. I'm topping that toasted bread with the tomatoes and baking it till it's warmed through, and then topping it with some cheese. Meals are often a pinch point for every homemaker and every person who has to feed themselves or another person because it has to be done so often. So over my blog at moonandmagnolia.com, I have a growing library of quick recipes for sides and dinners and sourdough and more. So you can check that out over at moonandmagnolia.com. But when you are in a homemaking rut and you feel like you can't get anything done, simplifying meals is key. I like to keep things around in the freezer for times like this, like leftover sourdough bread. And if I have a little bit of, as you'll see later, a little bit of leftover sourdough peach cobbler because I got sick and couldn't eat it. But having these little parts and pieces around can really make things easier when you are feeling like you can't get meals made. And in case you're wondering what I'm doing here, I am taking my freeze-dried tomatoes and I am blending them into a powder so I can condense them from 5 jars into 2 jars. I don't have a lot of pantry space, so as I am getting into food preservation season, I'm trying to figure out the best ways to store as much fresh food as I can, but without taking up too much space. But getting back into meals and food, one of the things I also like to do is to keep food around that is versatile. So those stewed tomatoes are really good as a side. They're great in soup. Obviously, they're good on sourdough. And so I like those sorts of things because I only have to make one thing, but I can use them in multiple ways. So that way, as I rebuild and reestablish my homemaking routine, I don't have to think about 100 different things to cook. I have this one thing that I can use in multiple ways. When I'm in this state of surviving and not thriving, it's really easy to just want to lay down, just get in bed and be there for a while until things feel right again. But the truth is, I often feel better if I just keep going. Of course, there is a time for rest and there's a time for reset. So I'm not just saying you have to power through into misery. But I do feel like keeping the momentum going helps, because things just need to be done. But also when we fall out of our routines, at least in my experience, what I find that's really happening is that a new routine is in the process of being created. Because sometimes things like being sick will throw you off your routine, but often when our routines aren't working anymore, it's because they need to change. And so by keeping the momentum going, you can build a new routine that works for this season of your life. Often things in our lives happen in a way to teach us something about how we are living our lives. And what I have learned very recently about my routine is that my life is easier if I make dinner earlier. Traditionally, I always started dinner around 5 o'clock, but I have found that if I make dinner around 3:30 and we can just reheat it later, my whole evening is better. I can clean up the kitchen in time. We have some time to spend together as a family. I can work on building my content without feeling so pressed for time in the evening. Here, I'm making a Spanish tortilla for dinner. So this is just a combination of sliced potatoes that are fried in a lot of oil. The recipe calls for like a cup of oil, but it's good. And you do drain the oil, so it won't all be in there. So it's potatoes that are fried in oil and then mixed together with eggs. I doubled this batch so that way we could have it for dinner. And then I've also been eating it for breakfast for the last couple of days. So this is also a pretty good hack for routine. If you're trying to get back into the swing of things, make a lot of food and just eat it for days. So I'm mixing together the fried potatoes and onions in the eggs and putting them back into this skillet and cooking it on, I'd say probably medium, low heat, just until the edges start to firm up. I think often a Spanish tortilla is then put onto a plate and turned over and put back into the skillet to finish cooking. But if we're talking about simplifying meals and building routine, I don't have time for that. So once the edges firm up, I'm putting in the oven at 350 until it is baked through. And then this is delicious by itself. I served it with salsa for dinner, but I think next time what I would do is serve it with those sweet and sour stewed tomatoes. They would be really good on there. But don't forget, I know I went on this spiel about self-care, but don't forget to treat yourself sometimes too. It is okay to do the things you love even when you are in a state of survival. Now, I'm not saying that you necessarily have to eat a bunch of junk food to do that, but that's what I am doing. So I made a sourdough peach cobbler a couple of weeks ago when I got sick. I had this whole cobbler, but I was sick, so we just threw it in the freezer and I thawed it out. It was a little funky when I thawed it, but I will say it worked perfectly to reheat it. The cobbler got nice and brown. It was warm and delicious. So keep a couple of things around just to treat yourself. But it is inevitable that homemaking and life sometimes is going to be hard. Sometimes we are going to be in a state of surviving. But if we don't have those moments, we can't even really appreciate the times that we're thriving, because these two things are juxtaposed. We understand one because we know the other. So when homemaking gets hard, do the best you can. Set the best routines that you can for yourself in those moments. If it's feasible, keep going, and know that on the other side of this rut, you will see yourself thriving. Thanks so much for stopping by today. I hope you are doing well, and I will see you again next time.